Part 1, The Beggar's Test. The December wind in Chicago doesn't just blow, it cuts. It slices through the seams of your coat, burrows into your bones, and reminds anyone foolish enough to stand on the sidewalk that winter doesn't care who you are. It only cares if you're warm enough to survive. Arthur Sterling knew that. But tonight, he wasn't standing in his penthouse on the 92nd floor of Sterling Tower, warmed by geothermal heating and triple-paned glass. He wasn't sitting in a $40,000 Italian leather armchair, swirling a glass of 50-year-old Macallan. He wasn't looking down on the glittering traffic like a god observing his creation. Tonight, Arthur Sterling lay curled on a damp piece of cardboard right in front of the Southside Community Health Clinic, in a neighborhood the rest of the city had long forgotten. He wore an old, faded military jacket, torn at the elbows, a wool cap pulled low over his forehead, a carefully glued-on gray beard, a white wig, and a pair of work boots worn thin at the soles. Around his neck hung a hand-painted sign in smeared ink: Veteran, Homeless, Anything Helps. No one knew that beneath those ragged clothes beat the heart of one of the richest men in America, and no one knew that heart was dying. 3 weeks ago, Arthur's personal physician had placed a thick manila folder on his mahogany desk. The doctor's voice trembled, not from fear, but from regret. "Mr. Sterling, your dilated cardiomyopathy has reached end stage. Your heart valves are failing. You may have 6 months or 6 weeks. I advise you to settle your affairs and spend time with your family." Family. Arthur had laughed when he heard that word, a dry, hollow laugh that never reached his eyes. His eldest son, Julian, had called that very afternoon. Not to ask about his health, not to ask if he was in pain. Julian asked only one thing: "Have you signed the amended will, Dad? The board is concerned about the fund's stability if you become unavailable suddenly." His daughter, Victoria, didn't even call. She sent an email from Switzerland, where she was vacationing after her 3rd divorce. The email was 3 lines long. "I hope you've arranged my share of the portfolio properly. Am considering a property in Geneva. Need budget confirmation before January." 40 years, Arthur Sterling had built Sterling Capital from a rented basement office into an $80 billion hedge fund. He had acquired dying companies, stripped their assets, fired thousands of employees, and called it capital efficiency optimization. He had taught his children that emotions were weakness, that compassion was an unrecoverable loss, and that the world was divided into only 2 types of people: predators and prey. And now, as his chest tightened with every breath, as his fingers occasionally went numb from poor circulation, he realized a bitter truth. He had created perfect predators, and now they were waiting for him to die so they could tear his empire apart. Arthur wasn't afraid of death. He was afraid of the emptiness. He was afraid that when his heart beat its last, not a single tear would fall for him. Only financial reports, transfer signatures, and the silence of people who once called him father. So, he decided to run a test. One final test before the darkness took him. He called it the Winter Challenge. He would disguise himself. He would go to the streets. He would sit in the coldest, poorest, most forgotten part of Chicago and wait. He wanted to know. In this world he had helped turn into a machine that crushed human kindness. Did any pure heart still exist? A stranger who didn't know who he was, who expected nothing from him, but would still stop when he fell. That person would receive $500 million from a secret charitable foundation he had quietly established. Not because of the money, but because he wanted to believe that goodness still existed, that his empire, though built on coldness, could end with one act of redemption. Before this story truly begins, I want to ask you something. Have you ever wondered if everything you've accumulated disappeared tomorrow? Would anyone stay by your side? Stories like this aren't just entertainment. They're mirrors reflecting what we truly value. If you're finding resonance in this journey, please subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you stories about redemption, about the gap between rich and poor, and about choices that define destinies. Every single week, your support helps us continue telling stories that reach the deepest corners of the soul. Arthur closed his eyes, pulled his wool cap lower, and waited. 2 hours passed. The temperature dropped to 23 degrees. Snow began to fall, small dry flakes falling straight down like ash. Hundreds of people walked past him. A man in an expensive suit hurried by, eyes glued to his phone. Polished leather shoes avoiding Arthur's cardboard like a puddle of dirty water. A young couple holding hands, laughing, walked past without a glance. A police cruiser slowed. The window rolled down. The officer looked at him for a second, then shook his head and rolled the window back up. The car drove on. Arthur didn't blame them. He understood the rules of this city better than anyone. In Chicago, indifference isn't a crime, it's a survival mechanism. If you stopped for every homeless person, you'd never make it home. If you opened your wallet to every pleading gaze, you'd be bankrupt before winter ended. He had taught this city that lesson through foreclosure policies, real estate acquisitions, slums demolished to make way for luxury condos, his own fund invested in. He had created a world where compassion was priced as weakness. And now, that world was giving him back exactly what he had sown. The pain came without warning. It started in the center of his chest, a sensation like someone gripping his heart. Arthur inhaled, but air wouldn't reach his lungs. He tried to sit up, but his right arm went numb. His vision blurred. The snowflakes turned into dancing white spots. The distant sound of car horns distorted into a ringing in his ears. He fell sideways, his cheek pressing against the freezing concrete. His wool cap slipped off. The anything helps sign flipped over in the wind. He tried to raise his hand, but his fingers only trembled in the air. He wanted to scream, but his throat only produced a weak, wheezing sound. A middle-aged woman walked by, looked at him, slowed for a second, then turned away and walked faster. A young man wearing headphones stepped on the edge of Arthur's cardboard, never noticing. A city bus drove past, splashing dirty slush onto his coat. Arthur closed his eyes. He could feel his heartbeat going irregular, each beat weak, sporadic, like a machine running out of fuel. He thought about his warm penthouse, the Egyptian cotton sheets, the private medical team on 24-hour standby, the children waiting for him to die. And he realized he would die here, on the sidewalk, and nameless, like a true beggar. It was the most fitting punishment for a life spent only calculating. But then, footsteps stopped. Not leather shoes, not expensive sneakers, worn rubber soles, hitting the sidewalk with heavy, exhausted steps. A figure knelt beside him. "Sir, sir, can you hear me?" That voice? It wasn't the voice of a saint. It was the voice of a woman who had worked 12 straight hours. A voice hoarse from fatigue, from dust, from night shifts in a free clinic where the heater always broke and medicine always ran short. But in that exhaustion, there was something Arthur hadn't heard in 40 years. Genuine concern. Arthur struggled to open his eyes. Through the blurry snow, he saw a face. Olive skin, deep brown eyes, hair pulled back in a neat bun. A few strands stuck to her cheeks with snow. She wore a faded light blue janitor's uniform, thin rubber gloves on her hands, and a name tag on her chest. Maya Torres, custodial staff. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't ask if he had money. She simply placed her hand on his wrist, checking his pulse. Her fingers were cold, but her touch was steady. Weak pulse, pale skin, dilated pupils, she muttered, almost to herself. "You've got hypothermia, and it looks like your heart's having trouble." She looked back at the empty street. No ambulance was coming. No one was stopping. She took a deep breath, then slid her hands under Arthur's armpits. "I'm going to take you to my place. It's only 2 blocks away. Hang on, sir. Don't fall asleep." Arthur wanted to say he didn't need help, that he could call his private security, that he was Arthur Sterling, and he didn't belong in her world. But his throat only produced a weak groan, and his body that had betrayed him, obediently let her lift him up. Maya wasn't strong. Arthur could feel it in how she panted, in how her arms trembled trying to support his weight. But she didn't let go. She guided him, step by step, across snowy sidewalks, through dark alleys, past brick walls covered in graffiti. Each step was agony, but each step was also a silent declaration. She would not let him die on the street. Maya's basement apartment was under an old apartment building, damp walls, wooden stairs creaking under every footstep. The door opened, a blast of cold air, the smell of mildew, cheap antiseptic, and thin soup wafting out. Arthur was placed on an old couch, sunken cushions, fabric torn at the corner. A thin wool blanket was draped over him. A small electric heater buzzed in the corner of the room, but it was only enough to melt the ice on his coat, not enough to warm the room. "Mom? Who's that?" A child voice came from the corner of the room. Arthur turned his head with difficulty. A boy about 7 years old was sitting on a floor mattress, wrapped in 2 layers of blankets. His skin was pale, his lips slightly blue, and in his hand was an old asthma inhaler. "It's okay, Leo," Maya said, her voice immediately softening when she looked at her son. "Mom brought a homeless man home, cold, and his heart's hurting. You stay in bed. Don't come out here. The cold air isn't good for your lungs." Leo nodded, his big round eyes looking at Arthur with a child's innocent curiosity. "Is he going to be okay, Mom? Mom will take care of him." Maya smiled at her son, then turned back to Arthur. The smile vanished, replaced by the focus of someone used to solving crises with empty hands. She removed his wet coat. She wiped his face with a warm towel. She checked his pulse again, counted his breathing, and frowned when she realized his heart rate was still irregular. "Do you have heart medication?" she asked. Arthur weakly shook his head. He had medication, but it was in the drawer of his bedside table in the penthouse, 15 miles away, and a world away. Maya was silent. She looked at the small refrigerator in the corner, opened it. Inside was half a carton of milk, a bag of old bread, and a pot of leftover thin soup. She closed the fridge, looked in her wallet, opened it, only a few small bills, less than $20 total. Emergency heart medication at the nearest pharmacy, $45, not counting the prescription, not counting the consultation fee if they required one. Arthur watched her. He saw the calculation in her eyes. Not the cold calculation of finance, but the desperate calculation of a mother trying to balance a stranger's life against her son's next meal. She turned back to the pot of soup, ladled out 2 bowls, one full of, one only half. She placed the fuller bowl on the small table next to Leo's bed. "Eat, honey. Stay warm." Leo looked at his bowl, then at his mother's. "You're eating so little, Mom?" "I'm not hungry," Maya lied, her voice steady. But Arthur saw clearly. Her throat swallowing hard. Her stomach had been empty since noon. She brought the remaining thin bowl of soup to Arthur. "Drink this slowly. It helped warm you up." Arthur took the bowl. His hands trembled, not from cold, but from an emotion he had buried long ago. He looked at the bowl of soup, clear broth, a few wilted vegetables, a pinch of salt. No meat, no seasoning. It was survival, diluted to the minimum. He took a sip. It was warm, it was salty, and it made his eyes burn. 40 years. He had eaten in 3-star Michelin restaurants. He had drunk wine worth more than Maya's annual salary. He had signed checks with so many zeros that bank tellers had to verify them 3 times. But never, not once, had he felt a meal carry this kind of weight, because he knew this bowl of soup was traded for her hunger, and possibly for the hunger of the son wheezing in the corner of the room. Night deepened. The temperature in the basement dropped. The electric heater sputtered and died. A fuse blew. Maya sighed. She stood up, about to check it, but Arthur suddenly convulsed. The second heart attack struck, stronger, more brutal. Arthur clutched his chest, his body curling up, his breathing turning into a choking wheeze. Cold sweat broke out on his forehead. His vision narrowed into a dark tunnel. He could feel his heart beating erratically, then slowing, then stopping for a second, then beating again, weakly. "Sir! Sir!" Maya rushed to him. She pressed her hand on his chest, checking his rhythm. Her face went pale. "No, you can't stop breathing here. Leo, call 911 for Mom. Quick!" Leo trembled as he picked up the old phone, but Maya suddenly remembered. Her phone service had been cut off last week for non-payment. She could only use the neighbor's Wi-Fi to text. She couldn't make emergency calls. She looked at Arthur. His lips were turning blue. His skin was ashen. Time was running out. Maya stood up. She ran to the small wooden dresser in the corner, opened the drawer, flipped through old papers, overdue bills, collection letters, and then her hand touched a small velvet box. She opened it. Inside was a wedding ring, white gold, thin, scratched with years of wear. On the band were engraved two initials, M and R, Roberto, her husband, the man who had died in a workplace accident 5 years ago when the construction company cut safety costs to boost profits, the man who left her with an asthmatic son, a mountain of medical debt, and a ring that was the only keepsake left. Maya held the ring. Her fingers trembled. She closed her eyes. A tear rolled down her cheek, falling onto the ring's surface. "I'm sorry, Roberto," she whispered, "but I can't let someone die in front of me while I still have something to trade." She slipped the ring into her coat pocket, put on her raincoat, and ran out into the snowy night. Arthur lay there, his consciousness hovering between life and death. He heard the door close, the sound of footsteps running up the wooden stairs, the wind howling outside, and he knew she was going to pawn the ring, the only keepsake, the only thing connecting her to the man she once loved, to buy medicine for a homeless old man she didn't even know. Arthur's heart, his failing heart, beat once hard, not from medication, but from shame, from awe, from a heart-wrenching pain he didn't know he was still capable of feeling. 20 minutes later, Maya returned, her hair wet with snow, her lips blue, but in her hand was a small bag of medicine. She tore open the box, took out the emergency heart pill, placed it under Arthur's tongue. She poured warm water into his mouth. She rubbed his chest. She counted his breaths. And gradually, his heart rate stabilized. His color returned. His breathing became more even. Arthur opened his eyes. He looked at Maya. She was sitting slumped on the floor, her back against the wall, panting. Her hands were empty. The ring was gone. "You're okay now," she said, her voice hoarse. "The medicine will get you through the night. Tomorrow morning, it'll take you to the free clinic. They have volunteer cardiologists." Arthur couldn't speak. Tears streamed down his wrinkled cheeks, mixing with cold sweat. When had he last cried? He couldn't remember. Maybe when he was a child, before the world taught him that tears were weakness. Now, he cried for a woman so poor she couldn't pay her phone bill, but was still richer than him in the only thing that truly mattered: compassion. When Maya fell asleep from exhaustion, Arthur gently sat up. His body was still weak, but his will had returned. He knew what he had to do. He pulled a small satellite phone from his torn coat pocket, something he always carried even in disguise. He dialed a single number. "Mr. Sterling?" His personal attorney Edward Vance's voice answered immediately. "Where are you, sir? We've been searching for you for 6 hours. Julian and Victoria are demanding an emergency board meeting." "Silence, Edward," Arthur said, his voice hoarse but firm. "Listen carefully. I want you to prepare transfer documents immediately. $500 million from the secret charitable foundation. Beneficiary is Maya Torres. Address?" He read the basement apartment address. "Wire transfer tomorrow morning. No questions, no delays, no notification to the board. Just do it." Edward was silent for 3 seconds. "Sir, $500 million to an unknown person? Are you certain?" "Anti-money laundering procedures will. I am Arthur Sterling. I don't need to explain to procedures. Do it now, and send me a basic background report on her, just to verify identity. I'll wait." Arthur hung up. He looked at Maya sleeping on the floor, looked at Leo breathing evenly under the blankets, and he felt a strange peace. He had found his heir, not Julian, not Victoria, not the predators he had created, but a janitor who had sold her last keepsake to save his life. $500 million would change her life, would cure Leo's asthma, would pay off the debts, would get them out of this damp basement, and would make Arthur Sterling, in his final days, feel that he had done one right thing. 15 minutes later, the phone vibrated. Edward was calling back. Arthur answered. Done? But Edward didn't answer right away. His voice was trembling, not from fear, but from horror. Mr. Sterling, I ran the background check. And you can't transfer money to her. Arthur frowned. Why? Does she have a criminal record? Tax debt? No, sir. Edward took a deep breath. Her record is clean, but her birth name is Maya Elena Torres, biological daughter of Mateo Torres. Arthur's heart stopped, not from disease, but from a shock that pierced straight through his chest, tearing open memories and pulling him straight into the abyss of the past. Mateo Torres. That name, like a dull knife cutting into his mind. 25 years ago, when Sterling Capital was still a small fund hungry for capital, Arthur had turned a blind eye to safety reports, used financial leverage to foreclose on Mateo Torres' steel mill, pushed an honest man to the edge, and laughed when Mateo hanged himself in his own warehouse so life insurance would pay his family's debts. That insurance money, $1 million, had been seized by the bank to pay off debts. Mateo's wife died of cancer 2 years later, without money for treatment, and his young daughter, Maya, had disappeared into the foster system, grown up in poverty, and now was sleeping on a damp floor after just pawning her husband's wedding ring to save the life of the man who had killed her father. Arthur dropped the phone. He sat there, in the darkness of the basement apartment, listening to Maya's steady breathing, listening to Leo's soft wheezing, and felt his entire $80 billion empire collapse into ashes inside his chest. He hadn't found an heir. He had found his own victim. Sometimes, the people we think are strangers are the ones carrying the wounds we ourselves inflicted. Arthur Sterling just realized that the goodness he sought came from the very woman whose past he had destroyed. And now, he must face a choice he cannot run from: use money to buy forgiveness, or confront the truth that some debts cannot be paid by check. If this story is touching something deep within you, subscribe now. Part 2 will reveal the full truth about the blood debt from 25 years ago. Maya's reaction when she discovers the true identity of the old beggar she just saved, and how Arthur Sterling will have to pay for every ruthless decision in his past. Don't miss it, because sometimes redemption doesn't begin with a check. It begins with the fall of a throne. Thank you for listening. See you in Part 2, where the darkness of the past will collide with the light of the present, and no one will walk out unchanged.